The air in Philadelphia during the sweltering summer of 1787 was thick enough to chew, a humid soup of horse manure, harbor salt, and the anxious sweat of 55 men who were technically committing treason against their own revolution. Most people think of the American founding as a pristine moment of clarity, but in reality it was a desperate, high-stakes gamble played by exhausted men in a locked room with the windows nailed shut to keep out spies and flies. You have to understand that at this moment, the United States were anything but. They were 13 bickering children holding on to a frayed rope, and the British were watching from across the pond, leaning against their warships and waiting for the entire experiment to collapse into a bloody civil war. James Madison, a man so small and frail that he was often mistaken for a sickly student, sat in the Pennsylvania State House with a notebook that would eventually change the course of human history. He wasn't a warrior like Washington or a firebrand like Adams. He was a library in a coat. He had spent years studying the failures of ancient Greece, the quirks of the Holy Roman Empire, and the messy collapses of the Dutch Republic. He knew that if they didn't find a way to balance the greed of the individual against the needs of the collective, this new nation would vanish before the century was out. The tension in that room was literal. Men were wearing wool suits in 90-degree heat, forbidden from leaking a single word of their debates to the press, while outside, the American public was starving for news and the economy was in a death spiral. The genius of what they were doing wasn't just in the laws they were writing, but in the psychological architecture they were building.
They were trying to solve the oldest problem in the world. How do you give a government enough power to protect the people without giving it enough power to crush them? The Great Compromise wasn't a boring legislative fluke, it was a screaming match between the big states who wanted to dominate and the small states who feared being erased. Roger Sherman, a shoemaker turned lawyer from Connecticut, stood up and proposed the split legislature we see today, the House and the Senate. It was a messy, imperfect fix that satisfied no one completely but kept everyone in the room. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere shifted from idealistic fervor to grim pragmatism. They tackled the 3/5 compromise, a dark and haunting stain on the document that reflected the brutal reality of slavery and the desperate need to keep the southern states from walking out and forming their own pro-British alliance. It is a reminder that history isn't a fairy tale of heroes, it's a ledger of difficult, often morally agonizing choices made by flawed humans trying to survive the next 24 hours. By the time September rolled around, the delegates were ghosts of their former selves. Benjamin Franklin, the oldest man there, had to be carried to the sessions in a sedan chair by prisoners from the local jail. On the final day, as the last signatures were being inked onto the parchment, Franklin whispered to those near him that throughout the session he had looked at that sun and couldn't tell if it was rising or setting. But now at length, he said with a tired smile, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun.
But the story didn't end with the signature. The real drama began in the taverns and town squares of the 13 colonies. The Federalist Papers weren't just essays. They were the first great American PR campaign, written at breakneck speed by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pseudonym Publius. They were fighting a war of ideas against the anti-Federalists, who rightfully feared that a central government would become a new king. This intellectual cage match led to the creation of the Bill of Rights, the essential add-on that guaranteed individual liberties. Without that compromise, the Constitution would have been a skeleton without a soul. This era taught the world that a nation isn't defined by its borders, but by its arguments. The United States was the first country in history to be founded not on a shared religion or a common ethnicity, but on a piece of paper and a set of ideas that are constantly being tested. Every time you see a protest, every time a law is challenged in court, and every time an election happens, you are seeing the echoes of those 55 men in that stifling, fly-ridden room in Philadelphia. They didn't build a perfect machine, they built a more perfect union, implying that the work is never actually finished. It was a leap of faith into the dark, fueled by the radical belief that people could actually govern themselves without a crown. If you enjoyed this deep dive, drop a like and share the story. Subscribe to Safiul Vibes for more historical mysteries. Thanks for watching.